So, hello and welcome to the second part of the new IDM series, IDM Democracy Talks, today on the issue of civil society protest. My name is Florian Voss, and we are here at the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe, and I will lead you through today's IDM Democracy Talks discussion and session. This session today is broadcasted live on our IDM Vienna YouTube channel, and if you want to be updated on a regular basis about different issues concerning the region of the Danube region and about what we do at our institute, you are more than welcome to follow our YouTube channel. We will be uploading regular videos here. The IDM Democracy Talks got implemented in the course of a Jean Monnet project from fictional to functioning democracy, developing concepts and strategies for an inclusive and participatory Europe, short FIFUDEM. With the support of the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, the Institute of the Danube region and Central Europe has launched a new series, the IDM Democracy Talks, that is addressing current democratic developments within and outside the European Union. Democracy has many patterns like participation, right to vote, equality, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and many more. Basically everything that has to deal with or that has to do with good governance in a broad sense. And looking back to the first episode of the IDM Democracy Talks, which has just been launched 2 weeks ago, we addressed there the issue of participation and representation. Today, we will kind of connect to that topic. The civil society needs to be represented in the political sphere as well, and protests and civil society protest is one important aspect and tool for representation. Today, we want to take a closer look to the different patterns of impact of civil society protest. We want to discuss the different forms of protests and protesters' effects on politics. Protest itself can be seen all over the world and sometimes has huge consequences. The Arab Spring showed us in 2010, for example, the immense power of the people, but also the challenges which appeared after that. In the Ukraine, we could see the pro-European protest, the Euromaidan, 2013, being strong enough to divide an entire country and disempower the former president Yanukovych, and to implement major changes. In Belarus, we can see right now what happens when people finally gather and protest for more democratic values, for their right for free and fair elections. And for this case, I'm also very excited to have someone here who might actually be able to give us some insights. I would now like to very warm welcome our guests from Belarus, Albania, and Germany. So first, Mrs. Natalie Satsunkevich, who is a human rights defender and working with victims of human rights violations. She is representing the Belarusian human rights organization Viasna, founded and headed by Ales Bialyatsky, who just received the Right Livelihood Award, also known as Alternative Nobel Prize. Viasna is known for his actions in legal defense for citizens and human rights engagement. So, Mrs. Satsunkevich, thank you for joining us today. My second guest for today is Mr. Besar Likmeta. He is journalist and country director of Albania for the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network BIRN. He has been first working for the Florida Times in the United States, and since 2007 he's in Albania working for BIRN again. In 2009 he received the award for outstanding investigative journalism, and I'm very happy to welcome you today. My third guest today is Dr. Piotr Kocyba. He is a board member of the Institute for Social Movement Studies in Berlin. He will be representing the social science perspective on civil society protest. Mr. Kocyba is working on the issue of different forms of protest, especially regarding the Pegida movement in Germany, and I'm looking forward to hear some experiences from his work. Welcome, Mr. Kocyba. And I would like to connect to that, because my first question would address you, Mr. Kocyba. So you are representing the social science perspective on civil society protest. One of your main fields of research is protest. You have done research on protest behavior in multiple protest groups. How has protest behavior been developing over time? And what are your main findings, especially for your study on the Pegida movement in Germany starting 2014?
Hi, nice to see you all. I think it depends how I answer the question. It depends from the time perspective you're asking for. If we look back in so-called Western democracies, what happened after the Second World War, first of all, we have the rise of the so-called new social movements. So a phenomenon that points out to the fact that it's not only the workers' class which is protesting, which is on the streets, but that we can see more and more people connected to some ideas, not to materialistic patterns, but to so-called post-materialistic patterns, like, for instance, the ecological movement. And within this development, we can see since the 90s latest, something which we could call normalization of protest. In Western democracies, it became quite usual that people are going out onto the streets to demonstrate for whatever. And we could speak in the social movement studies because of that of movement society. And in the last years, we can observe that we are dealing with this kind of normalization also for the right-wing part of our societies. So it becomes more and more usual that not only those liberal and lefty people are organizing themselves and going out onto the streets to demand things they want to, but we can see it also more and more regularly with racist, xenophobic, and right-wing or far right-wing aims. And one of the best examples for this is indeed in Germany, at least, Pegida, which is the most successful right-wing protest mobilization since the Second World War. And Pegida started to march in the end of 2014 with two peaks of mobilization in 2015. This was in January and in October, where up to 20,000 people went out onto the streets. And Pegida is still marching through Dresden, not every week anymore, but I think around every second week. And the numbers are low because it's now a few hundred or maybe a few thousand people out on the streets. But it shows very clearly that we are now dealing with right-wing protest as a phenomenon that is quite normal and usual, unfortunately, quite normal and usual, also for the German public.
And how would you say, did it come to that point? Because I would see that there is like the taboo that has been in place long time, maybe has fallen. So people are actually now thinking that they might be allowed to protest for, or it might be like appropriate to protest also for right-wing purposes, which maybe in the past wouldn't have happened before. What do you think?
I mean, there were many of protests, smaller protests before that. We can go back even to the beginning of the 90s in Germany, when we had racist, violent events, especially in former GDR. And also shortly before Pegida, we had protests in smaller towns around Dresden, in which people were hostile against the idea that there are new refugees to be welcomed in their communities. So there was a ground which was waiting for an event, and Pegida was just lucky that there was a group of friends who picked up this feelings within Dresden and the surroundings, feelings of anti-refugee attitudes, and puts them into an idea, the idea of this patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident. And then they were lucky that they hit, the so-called zeitgeist. And I think this is basically what happened. There was anger, and the anger was growing. And at some point further, sooner or later, it had to be visible also on the streets.
And when you speak about anger, do you also see like a increasing role of radicalization among those people? Because in the media would cover scenes where refugees got chased through the streets, and where you could get the feeling that it's getting more and more radical, that entire movement.
I would say that Pegida, for instance, was radical from the beginning. It's also shown by data, because there were several surveys conducted among demonstrators of Pegida from the beginning of 2015 till the midst of 2016. And the numbers show us that Pegida already in the beginning of 2015 was so radical in its attitudes, in its worldview, that it couldn't get more radicalized. But still, what happened, you're totally right. People had the feeling that at some point it's okay to not only speak out all these racist attitudes, but also to take action. So there are cases of Pegida even speakers who prepared some bombs and put it in front of mosques. Interesting. We had this so-called hot summer in Saxony in 2015 with the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis, where Pegida exploded not only in numbers, but also spread all over the villages and small towns in Saxony with very hostile, very unpleasant events against the refugees which were arriving in Germany and also in Saxony. So Pegida indeed had an influence on the radicalization, but Pegida itself was radical from the beginning.
Okay, and I mean, when we speak about radicalization, then to me, the question appears pretty quickly. So where does civil society protest ends, and when would you start talking about civil disobedience or even terrorism? Because like when it gets violent, where's the border that has to be crossed to not be civil society protest anymore?
I think that protests can have many faces. There's a broad repertoire of protest forms. I mean, you can nowadays protest by forwarding something on your Facebook profile. You can protest by signing a petition. You can protest by going out to join a demonstration. You can take part in a strike like Fridays for Futures, for instance. And you can also protest by breaking law. And I think it is important that we don't put civil disobedience into the corner of violence and terrorism, because civil disobedience is per definition not violent. It's just the idea that me as a citizen, I am willing to break law to show the world that I'm breaking the law because of some regulations or new legislative measures, and I want to protest by it. And the only aim is not to harm anyone, to get violent, but just to pay the price for breaking the law in public. Because I know by breaking the law, it's most probable that the police will take me and that I will be sued by the state. And this is the idea of civil disobedience. And violence is something completely different. Even so, of course, violence has is part of protest. It can sometimes occur during demonstrations or also during individual protest acts. But this is not the majority of protest acts. Even on the right side, where the atmosphere is hostile, nowadays we don't see big riots in Germany. Most of those demonstrations try to stay calm, just to make the appearance of being, bourgeois, being part of the center of the society.
So when we are talking about protests, we sometimes forget what we might that we might oversee the different kinds of impact it can generate on democracy. On the one side, the civil society might be aiming for a more democratic, rights, like a case which we can see right now in Belarus, for example. On the other side, protests can foster rather non-democratic developments by questioning democratic values, democratic systems that are in power. And how would you explain such differences in protests, and what role does nationalism play in that context as well?
I mean, you're touching now a topic which is for me very interesting from the scientific perspective, because actually for a long time, by definition, civil society was seen as something positive. Civil society was, teaching the citizens to become better democrats, simply by the fact that they were sitting together and organizing themselves. And civil society does not need by definition to be political. We are speaking of civil society, even if it's, some small association in some small town, peripheral town, organizing, the yearly Halloween event for the village. This is also part of the civil society. And since Tocqueville, we are speaking of civil society as a school for democracy, because citizens are forced to come together, to take decisions together as a collective, to find some ways how to decide, to organize themselves. So democracy, civil society was for a long time seen only as something very positive, which strengthens democracies. And this is also why many scholars were concerned if it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, because just looking at the data, we saw that the civil societies in these areas are weaker than in Western Europe. And we were thinking that if there's a weaker civil society, then it's not good for democracy, because by definition, democracy needs a strong civil society sector. But since a few years, it becomes more and more visible that civil society is also a part where those forces, players which are violent sometimes, which don't share our liberal democratic values, which indeed even fight our liberal democratic values. And Pegida, again, is a very nice example for this. And so it's a paradox, because there are citizens using the free space which is created by democratic states to organize yourself, and they're using this free space to fight this free space. And of course, nationalism is one of the key moments to explain why people are organizing themselves to destroy their own freedom of assembly, for instance. But it's not only nationalism, it's also xenophobia, it's also anti-LGBT motives, all this what maybe we can call illiberal values or regressive values. And as I said in the beginning, this is actually something which we observe more and more in the last years, that this movement society is now also being occupied more and more visibly, not only by those left and liberal parts of the society, by those we could call the new social movements, but also by this regressive right-wing, sometimes even radical right-wing forces in the society.
So thank you, Mr. Kocyba, for those views. After we have now taken a close look on the theoretical aspects from a social science perspective, I would like to talk about the actual situations on the ground. Therefore, we have Mrs. Natalie Satsunkevich from Belarus here today. She is part of the civil society movement. And Mrs. Satsunkevich, you are representing the active civil society. And in this position, you are today confronted with huge challenges in your home country in Belarus. We probably have all seen it in the media, what's happening since weeks there. And what possibilities exist for you to express your opinions, and what does civil society protest means for you personally?
Thank you for this invitation and for your questions. If we start from the beginning, it's really the situation in Belarus is extremely interesting being here also, and extremely hard to work here as a human rights organization and human rights defenders. I started monitoring peaceful assemblies in Belarus in 2015. And we exactly can say that such amount and such protests we haven't seen for 20 years. That's true. Something similar was in 19th, but we can't compare. And for today, we see that the protests are almost 3 months long, and that's very unusual for Belarus. And I want really to highlight that this culture of peaceful protest in Belarus unfortunately was very poor, and it's connected that this right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression was very limited, both on the level of the law and on practice. And a big part of our work as human rights organizations was education in sphere of human rights, and also we did a lot in Juneau about peaceful assemblies. I personally took part in advocacy campaigns both in Belarus and also on international level, just to show and to help people to understand this value of all these rights. And we see now how people finally started to realize to exercise their rights, and for me that looks great. And unfortunately, we see the reaction of Belarusian authorities on this, how they arrest people, beat them, ban, and people got arrests and fines for their only because of participating in peaceful assembly. And we see now that in Belarus, not only these Sunday protests are going, we also see cooperation of civil society on different levels. And it starts from your own ground, where you meet your neighbors, and thousands of small Telegram chats began existing, and people finally communicate with their neighbors and plan and do common activities. We see now, for example, different lectures on culture or musical concerts in different regions of city. And that looks very unusual for Belarus and very inspiring for me. I think that, and also we see how people of Belarus use these symbols of that traditionally protesting flag, and these colors of white and red, and different new symbols, and you can find it everywhere on street art, on new stickers on Telegram, on new hashtags and so on. And all these, of course, methods are okay and good for expressing opinion. But these mass protests on Sundays, they are all, I think, the most important thing for today.
Yeah, you were already mentioning it. The new media, the new social media. We've heard that also from Arab Spring, for example, where without social media, people wouldn't be able to gather in short time spontaneously. And you were also talking about those cultural activities. So what role does social media play in your activism?
Sure, the development of internet and social media play a great role in this process, in cooperation with people, in spreading information. Because if you watch only government TV in Belarus, that's nothing about truth, unfortunately. So those who have good access to internet, and in Belarus, it's most people have this access, fortunately, and you will get this information. But I have to mention that after the elections day, and on the elections day, 9th of August, and 3 days later, there was massive blockage of internet in Belarus, and most people didn't have any information what is going. And also now we see this blockage of internet on days of protest, on Sundays, for example. And we see that, for example, these traditional Sunday marches, they don't need now so many information. So people are ready, they have some plans. And when people meet, so like this assembly is coming very natural. So internet is very good and useful, but for today, if we speak, for example, about Sunday protests, very good, people cooperate, but I think that not now it's not it's like the biggest part of this protest.
Yeah, very interesting topic, I think. But if you how would you expect, if you could decide how a government responds to your actions, so how would you expect a government to deal with civil society protests in a more constructive way, where you say, okay, this actually, the government actually reacts to our words in an appropriate way?
Yeah, unfortunately, we see how Belarusian authorities deny these protests of Belarusian people, and there is no any dialogue. We see how authorities use all these repressions, starting from detaining people, arresting them, fining, and also criminal cases. We know more than 400 criminal cases from the beginning of the election campaign. And I have to mention that this year election campaign was totally done in this atmosphere of fear and repression. So I hope that authorities of Belarus will start this productive dialogue with people in some days, because they have to do that. There is no other way. And also, it's like some fresh news that we saw yesterday and today, Alexander Lukashenko's speeches about that authorities and police should be more aggressive and to stop this protest. And that sounds like not in a good manner. We don't see there any possibilities, any wish from the authorities for dialogue, unfortunately, but they have to do that.
So the human rights organization Vyazna, I think, is one of the most famous Belarusian human rights organizations, and also your founder and head of the institution, Ales Bialyatsky, is internationally well known. How would you describe the impact you, as a relatively well-known and large human rights organization in the country, how would you describe the impact you can generate as an organization on the government and on pro-democratic movements?
Yeah, sure. Vesna started in 1996, and for today we have 16 offices all over the country, and we have different branches of our activities. And for example, as I mentioned, educational one, but for today is not so actual and hot, for example. Also, we have our website where we present all information, and it's very important. We prepare every month reports and also thematical reports on different issues. We work with advocacy on international level with UN treaty bodies and so on. And also, I think our main sphere, what we do now is helping people, those who come to our legal advices offices every day. From July, we work 24/7, not only in Minsk, but in other cities too. And now we have all over the country, I mean, about hundreds of requests from people every day. We help people, those who were fined, arrested, to prepare documents with a lawyer. Also, we work with those who are under criminal cases and their families to support them in different ways. Also, I have to mention very important issue about political prisoners. We have about 100 people in Belarus who are named political prisoners. And unfortunately, there are more people who would be political prisoners. They are in jail now. And also among these political prisoners are two of my colleagues, those who were arrested only because of doing their human rights work and helping people. So now I think that we mostly focus on everyone and try to use these personal possibilities for people to help, because like we see that civil society are people, but you have to help everyone.
Yeah, so you were mentioning already that even friends of you are imprisoned right now, and obviously we can see that every Sunday when you protest that people get arrested. So obviously it is very dangerous for you. And there, for me, the first question occurs that, is there any alternative to street protest? Is there anything else which might have an impact, which wouldn't put you in such a danger? Or is it just the price you pay if you want to gain such an impact?
I think it's really a price of some people and democracy, because I think that only this massive Sunday protest shows authorities that people are against Lukashenko, and also authorities can see that that they will have support of people if some authorities would be also against Lukashenko. We see how some police officers leave their positions, and that's also mostly because of that they see the support of people. And so on this stage, I should say that this protests are very important.
So thank you, Mrs. Satsunkevich, for your perspectives and from the region and from the ground. We have now heard not only the social science perspective, but also the practical view. Our third guest today will be able to offer us even a third perspective. So, Mr. Likmeta, you have a long time experience in collaborating with NGOs, multiple NGOs and civil society organizations. And your role as a journalist and as a media representative is always special, since you are monitoring a situation and development from a rather comparative politics perspective. So due to your long year journalist experience, also from the USA, and in addition to that, due to your general view, you're able to develop a deeper understanding of the general civil society situation and the protest culture. And based on that perspective, what changes could you experience in the past, let's say 10 years, for NGO movements and for civil society actions?
Well, I would like to go a little bit further in time and say that, like, once Albania returned its Stalin-style dictatorship in the early 90s, we knew very little about the civic space. I mean, it was a society where everything before was controlled by the state, and the civic space was controlled by the Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Albania. After the revolution in 91, what happened is that, which actually started through student protests, and then unions and strikes, very similar to what's going on in Belarus. What happened is that the West tried to create a civic space. tried to create a professional class through donors and founding organizations, which were thought through time will have balanced the power of the newly created political parties and help navigate Albania's transition to democracy. Unfortunately, 3 decades later, we're still in a very difficult, very tumultuous transition to democracy. The power of political parties remains very strong. The oligarchs and the connection between oligarchs and politicians has become very unison and control the media. They try to control also social media and the civic space. The problem with the civil society as it was envisioned by the West, it was in the early 90s, and this you found this professional class of organizations and people who probably connect to the grassroots and become their voice, didn't work very well because they became also a professional class. They didn't get in touch with the grassroots and the people. And also because of our lack of tradition in terms of grassroots and organizing, when all their organizing was seen as something imposed by the state, the problem was that the civic class of organizations and NGOs tended to become part of the ruling class. They became professionalized in a sense, and being more professional organizations who did projects, who implemented, let's say, instruments to improve people's lives, but people didn't feel that they represented their voice as much. The thing that we've been trying to do as a media during the last decade is try to bridge this gap between civil society, the media themselves and journalists, but also the communities who actually are rising and trying to raise their voice about very different issues. You can start from the local level. In Albania, we have a huge problem with the use of water. We're a country very rich in water resources, but there is a lot of rivers being dammed and a lot of communities fighting against developers, against hydropower plant developers. And this is a problem across the region. And we also will have more national protest movements, like student movements. For example, in the last few years, we've had the major student movements protesting government efforts to reform the university system, in a sense reform, because what this oligarchic system that we have in Albania of political parties, which tend to be mostly left and right, but normally they're very neoliberal. They want to give money to this private scheme of funding private universities through taxpayers' money when the university system is underfunded. But also we have the protests from political parties, because political parties have been using protests as a tool for the last 3 decades. And we see a huge difference between all these kinds of forms. First, you have the political parties who tend to use protests through their followers as a power tool against their political rivals. And these protests tend to be very violent. These protests tend to, let's say, organize in between, represent the political interests of a small group of people who run political parties, which are the same from 3 decades. I mean, the current president in Albania has been out of power for the last 3 decades. He's been an MP, a former leader of parliament, a foreign minister, prime minister also has been in power from being Minister of Culture, Mayor of Tirana since '98. Opposition leader is very similar. So you have the civic space dominated by oligarchs and political leaders who try to control it. And then you have smaller groups. You have, for example, as I said, the communities protests for their local rights on the local level. You have the students who tend to be a more national, let's say, campaign and let's say a voice about national issues, which would be in this case education. And you have the political parties on the side. I'm not saying that the whole, let's say, professional civil society doesn't have a role to play. It is on the media side important that you need professional organizations to articulate better the problems of local civil society, civic groups. What we've seen, for example, with this hydropower plant protests from local communities is that they needed the support of. They were successful when they had the support of civil society organizations who were professionals, who could do strategic litigation, who could speak in the national media and in social media organized better, who could make their campaigns international, just not local. For example, one successful campaign was from the Vjosa River, which is one who's considered by environmentalists one of the last wild rivers in Europe. And that happened this development was stopped only because you had local communities protesting, you had national organizations, environmental organizations supporting them, you had professional organizations of lawyers who provided strategic litigation and lawsuits, but you also have the international organizations who helped spread the issues beyond borders. The same thing can be said with the student movement, who tends to be more sophisticated, is more sophisticated in terms of counteracting the attempts of political parties to control them. The use of social media also helped for a period in the last few years to organize. But also we see in the last few years that also social media is not the tool that it used to be. It is very, political parties have tried to control it and use it, and oligarchs do have, let's say, created disinformation campaigns through social media, and they also use it to divide communities in that sense. So I think the media plays a role, especially alternative media, to give a voice to the civic space and try to articulate better to a wider audience their problems. It's not always easy. It's not always done well. I think the problem with the media is also that it's also controlled mostly by oligarchs. So this is left mostly to alternative media outlets who are non-profits. And also the problem that most of the protests in Albania from the, let's say, communities are going against very powerful people, very powerful political interests, let's say developers, the oil industry, which have a lot of advertising money to spend on national media outlets, and they can basically buy propaganda campaigns who are broadcast as news on the national television stations. So the communities, the activists, they're left with the tools that they have, with the few non-profit media outlets which are not controlled by the oligarchs, and they are left with the, let's say, with the social media, which also has become a very treacherous place. But I think the only thing left out there so they can communicate to a wider audience. The problem, I think, is that it's not, let's say, a straight line of progress. That the transition to democracy is very difficult. If we evolve, if we learn new ways to organize a civil society or media outlets, how to give a voice to the civil society, the other side, the oligarchs and the politicians, they also learned about these tools. They also use these tools, and they have the money to buy the best consultants in the West. They have the money to buy the best companies, how to use social media outlets, how to spread disinformation campaigns. And unfortunately, this is coming from former political leaders from the West. They are consultants, they're spin doctors. So there is a I think an evolving phenomenon. It's a struggle for democracy that just doesn't start one day and you have a revolution and everything it's possible and everything is reachable. I think it takes a lot of time to create a culture of democratic values. It takes a lot of time to transition to democracy. And then even what we've seen in the West or in some Eastern European countries who are more successful than us in this democratic game, like Hungary or Czech Republic, we've seen this phenomenon of the dancing bears, that people learned these democratic values that were brought by Western Europe and let's say from the European Union, but we'll see backtracking to the old ways of populism and authoritarian rule, lack of media freedom, and attack on civic activists.
Yes, so you've been mentioning you as a media and the connection to, on the one side, to the civil society, and on the other side to the communities, to the local communities. What is your relationship to the political sector, and do you think the media is today maybe even more politicized than it was in earlier times?
It is. I mean, unfortunately, we had in the last decade. We had a deteriorating media situation in Albania, but also across the region, not only in the Western Balkans, I would say, but also in some European member states in Central Europe. And this is not an assessment that I do, but it's an assessment made by international media watchdogs who report on media freedom. And despite let's say, the support that we receive from the European Union, despite the support that we see from, let's say, this international community of journalists and organizations, we see that the power, the local political elites have understood very well that the power, the role and the power that media plays as the fourth estate in let's say, in a pluralistic society. So they're trying everything to control this fourth estate. And it's easier to do it in countries who don't have a long tradition of media freedom. It's easier to do it in countries where, understandably, there is no, let's say, pluralistic market of media. So the government government political parties not only have the money to invest because of the corruption, because of the state capture, but also they have the instruments. For example, we had in recent years, because the media outlets like ours have become and others have become more important to local audiences, we saw the government introducing new amendments to the media law, which basically would give them control to an administrative body to censor media outlets. So they're pushing, even when they control most mainstream media and they see alternative outlets as a threat to their control, to the narrative, or the political narrative, that's what is going on in the country, they also try to push legislative measures which are undemocratic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Likmeta, for your journalist perspective on the issue of civil society and civil society protest. And now we're actually coming to our final round for today, which will be more focused on your personal opinion. And the format of the IDM Democracy Talks is designed to incorporate the experts' personal views. And I'm also especially interested in your future perspective on civil society and civil society protest. And I think regarding the time, we try to keep it a little shorter, not to exceed the time limits. So thank you for that. And my first question here, I would like to address to Mrs. Satsunkevich. So looking at Belarus, things are getting more and more intense and polarized. What do you expect to happen in the future? How will protests be like, and how do you think will the situation of civil society organizations be like in the future?
Thank you. It's really very interesting, because now in Belarus we see this process of forming of civil society, because it was strongly blocked before, and also according to the law, the Belarusian law of freedom of association is not the best. And also in practice, any activities should be under the control of government. And we have a lot of pro-government organizations for youth, for women, for pensioners, and so on. So I'm really expecting to see how people would act after in some democratic situation. And for now, we see that at last 3 months, there were a lot of volunteers and initiatives when people come together and start their activities. Some of these activities stopped after there were no more need, but some of them are alive for these days and continue this work. For today, there is no possibility for these organizations or initiatives to get registration, even if they want that. But I hope that in the future, if people want really to organize and to have this official legal status, they would have this possibility. I agree that this process of forming of society and democracy is difficult, and I hope that in Belarus we will see, I don't know, this year, next one, the beginning of this process, and that we will avoid the experience of other countries and societies, and maybe we would have less problems, but we'll see.
And what might be your recommendations for other European countries which appear to be compared to Belarus, such as Serbia, or regarding liberal developments in Hungary or Poland, or also towards Albania, which is also in a difficult position?
Mm-hmm. I think that's very difficult and non-productive to compare countries, situations, and civil societies, because there are so many details in every case. But I always call to respect human rights and have this basis of human rights, and that would be a great base.
Yeah, definitely. It is always hard to compare individual situations. That's definitely a true point. Mr. Likmeta, so the media is always in a critical position, especially when it comes to emotional and political issues. Today, we are often confronted with huge cleavages between left and right-wing media, and many people, as we can see also in the United States, and I'm sure you're aware of that since you have like a huge experience working in the United States. Many people would believe the so-called fake media, so they wouldn't believe the media at all and would call it just fake media. In that context, how do you see your own personal role and future as an active reporter on civil society improvement movements and NGOs?
Well, the situation in the Western Balkans is very similar to what you see in the US, but what you see in the US lately. I think we had Trumpism in the region before Trumpism existed. The disinformation campaigns ran because of the control the political parties, or let's say the political leaders and the oligarchs had on mainstream media outlets has always been there. We have prepackaged news broadcast as news. We have, let's say, an army of spin doctors which appear in television, which is very common also in US television, every night, whose only goal is to, let's say, disinform the public about the issues and spin them in the favor of certain political and economic interests. So this is not easy to fight, but it's, I think there is a realization among the people that this has become an oligarchic system, in the sense that the elites, which includes the media, which includes also part of this professional civil society, are on one side benefiting, and there is the rest of the masses who don't have a voice, who are economically weak, and who are living in troughs and migrating in Western Europe. If we want to make a future in this country, we have no choice but to actually stand up to political and economic interests and balance the power of this political economic interests with the interests of our communities, the interest of our kids to have an education, the interest of our rivers to be clean and our seas to be clean and have an environmentally healthy country, the right to healthcare and universal healthcare and quality healthcare. So, and this should, I think, be very important to a community, but it's not an easy struggle. And sometimes as a reporter, it is actually depressing to see this Sisyphean struggle. When you see the rock, you report the rock going up, and then you have to report the rock going down. And this repeats itself in cycles. And I hope that some progress would be made. It's not always the case, but I still think the struggle is important. And we have to bear witness as media outlets, because there is no other way.
Mr. Kocyba, looking at recent developments in comparison to protest behavior since 2000, what is your personal opinion on how civil society protest is going to develop in the future?
Looking at the time, I will make it very brief. I think that the polarization, also in the Western societies, will increase within the next years. Increased polarization produces anger on both sides, and anger can lead to street protests. So I think for me as a protest researcher, there are golden times coming. We will have plenty of things to conduct research on. If it's so good for the democracy, that's a different topic.
Yes, for sure. I think that is definitely the truth, that there are golden times for protest researchers like you are ahead of us. So to all of us, to all of you, of course, thank you very much for being part of that discussion, and thank you. That has been your main conclusion now. Thank you as well, Mr. Satsunkevich, and thank you, Mr. Likmeta. I think we have seen today a lot of different patterns of civil society and civil society protests, and that we are facing challenges in many different ways. And I think we're all curious on how things will develop in future times, and what role protest will play, and where we will be able to find the civil society and how that is going to develop. This has been the second part of the IDM Democracy Talks series. If you like what you saw, please follow us on YouTube. As I said, there is more to come on many different issues on a regular basis. And again, many thanks to all of our guests, all of my guests today. And thank you so much for joining me and us here today at IDM. Okay, I think we're off now. We're offline now. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.